Come away with me for a little while, not far, only backward, through the soft dark that sits between now and long ago, until the calendar itself dissolves, and we are standing on ground no map remembers. Let your shoulders loosen into the pillow beneath you. There is nowhere else you need to be tonight, and nothing here will ask anything of you except to listen. We are going to an island so small that ships forgot to look for it, so quiet that even the gods seemed to lower their voices when they spoke its name. That name, when it is spoken at all, is Ogygia. Here the evening air carries the sweet burn of cedar smoke rising from a hearth cut straight into rock, and underneath it, fainter, the cool mineral breath of a spring that has never once run dry in all the turning of its seasons. Somewhere back past the tree line, a goat bell answers itself, twice, and then falls still, as though it too has decided to listen. And down where black volcanic stone meets the tide, a man sits with his knees drawn up to his chest, watching water the color of a bruise just beginning to heal, patient and dark and endless. His name is Odysseus, and you may already know fragments of what brought him here: the wooden horse, the 10 years of war before it, the 10 years of wandering that followed. But this piece of the story is smaller than the rest, and far less often told, and it may be the strangest part of the whole long tale. This is the part where a man is offered the one thing every mortal creature has ever quietly wanted, without ever quite admitting it out loud. And he says no, gently, without a war, without a monster. He simply, quietly, refuses to stop being human. If you are settling in for the night, let this be the one room where nothing more is asked of you. You do not need to remember the names that follow, or the order the islands come in. Your only task tonight is to breathe slow and easy, and let the story do the carrying. If a tale like this is good company at the end of your day, it helps these small fires find other tired travelers when you leave a kind word on your way out. And if you'd like, you might mention where in the world you're listening from tonight and what hour it is there where you are. There is something quietly nice about picturing all these different clocks, all these different dark windows, settling towards sleep at their own pace, together. Behind the man on the shore, past a stand of black poplar and pale-leaved alder, the mouth of a cave opens into the hillside, and firelight moves inside it the way firelight always moves, restless, alive, throwing soft gold across walls hung thick with grapevine and violet dark ivy. A goddess lives in that cave. Her name is Calypso, and depending on which storyteller you happen to ask, she is a daughter of the Titan Atlas, who holds the sky itself on his shoulders far to the west. Or she is something older still, some dimmer and more original power whose true name wore away long before anyone thought to write it down. Some traditions claim she has always looked exactly as she looks tonight, neither young nor old, because nothing on this particular island is permitted to age. She is singing quietly to herself as she works a golden shuttle back and forth through her loom, and the thread she weaves holds colors that don't quite exist anywhere beyond this shoreline. A green that is almost a sound, a gold that is almost a taste on the back of the tongue. She has kept this man 7 years. She has fed him from her own table, warmed him through every one of Ogygia's mild winters, and loved him, as best a goddess is able to love a mortal thing. And more than once, in the quiet after supper, she has offered him the largest gift that can be given to any living creature: to stay, to never age another day, to simply stop dying. To understand why a man would hesitate, even for a single held breath, before accepting a gift like that, we have to go back further than this shoreline. Back past a sea route that no living pilot could ever redraw from memory, back to the smoking ruins of a city that no longer exists under that name, and to the God who decided that this one man out of every soldier who survived that war would be made to travel the longest road home of them all. Troy fell at night, the way great things often do, not in one final blaze of glory, but through a trick. A hollow wooden horse dragged through gates that should never have opened. Odysseus was the mind behind that trick, clever in the particular, restless way that eventually makes even the gods a little uneasy. He should have simply sailed home afterward, his part in the war finished, his name already growing into legend. But somewhere in the smoke and the plunder of that final night, his ships put in at the land of a people called the Cyclopes, and there, in a cave that smelled of curdled milk and old fleece, racks of drying cheese hung from the low ceiling, and pens of bleeding lambs crowded the back wall, he blinded a shepherd with one enormous eye set in the middle of his forehead, a son of the sea god Poseidon, named Polyphemus. It had seemed, at the time, like survival. The giant had rolled a boulder so wide across the cave's mouth that 20 men together could not have shifted it, and he had already eaten several of Odysseus's crew, 2 at a time, before Odysseus offered him strong, undiluted wine and told him, when asked his name, that it was nobody. When the giant finally slept off that wine, Odysseus and his remaining men drove a heated olive wood stake into his single eye, and when Polyphemus screamed for the neighboring giants to come help him, and they called back through the rocks asking who had hurt him, he could only answer, truthfully and uselessly, that nobody had done it. So no one came. There was no way past the giant except through him, and even blinded, he nearly caught them as they slipped out beneath the bellies of his own sheep at dawn. But as Odysseus's ship pulled away from that shore, unable to resist one last boast of his own cleverness, he called back his real name across the water, and the blinded giant lifted both hands to the sky and asked his father to curse him by it. "Let this man lose all his companions," the Cyclops prayed, "and let him come home late, in a stranger's ship, having suffered greatly, and let him find his own household in ruin when at last he arrives." Poseidon, shaker of the earth, heard every word of it, and from that morning on, the sea itself became something closer to an enemy than a road. Not every danger that followed came wearing teeth. On an island of drowsy warmth, not far from that first shore, Odysseus's crew met a gentle, generous people who offered them a meal of the lotus, a small honey-colored fruit that tasted by every account like nothing else that grows anywhere else in the world, sweet in a way that seemed to reach past the tongue and settle directly into the chest. The men who ate it forgot, quite peacefully, that they had ever wanted to go home at all. They sat in the soft grass, smiling at nothing in particular, no longer homesick, no longer restless, no longer anything much at all, faces slack with a contentment that had cost them every reason they'd ever had for moving. Odysseus had to drag them back to the ships, weeping and clawing at the sand, grieving for a sweetness they could no longer name, and bind them beneath the rowing benches until the wanting of home came back to them on its own. Even then, this early in the story, forgetting was already showing itself as its own small kind of dying, a comfort so complete it erased the very reason a person might want to keep living. There was a floating island next, ringed by an unbroken wall of bronze cliff, ruled by a keeper of the winds named Aeolus, who lived there with 12 grown children, paired off into 6 contented marriages, and feasted with them nightly to the sound of pipes that never seemed to stop playing. Aeolus gave Odysseus a leather bag, its neck bound shut with a cord of bright silver wire, holding every storm wind in the world sealed inside it, except the one gentle breath that would carry him safely home. For 9 days, that kind wind blew true, and on the 10th, with the coastline of his own Ithaca finally visible on the horizon, close enough that Odysseus could almost name the hills by memory, exhaustion finally won the argument he'd been having with his own body, and he slept. While he slept, his crew, certain the bag held some hidden treasure he meant to keep for himself, opened it. Every trapped wind roared out at once, and the ships were flung backward across the whole distance they had struggled so hard to cross, all the way to Aeolus's floating shore again, where the Wind Keeper, now afraid of whatever anger had chosen this man, refused to help him a second time. After that came the land of the Laestrygonians, giants of a harbor so narrow and so glassy still that it looked, from a distance, like the safest anchorage any tired fleet could hope to find. Cliffs rising sheer on both sides, the water inside barely rippling. It was, in fact, a trap built by the shape of the land itself. The giant king's wife came down to the ships first, enormous and welcoming, and lured a handful of scouts up to the palace, where her husband snatched one from the group and ate him on sight, then raised the alarm. Boulders the size of houses came down, after that from the cliffs on both sides at once, onto ships that could not turn fast enough in such a narrow space to escape, spearing the men in the water like fish in a shrinking net. Odysseus lost nearly his whole fleet in that harbor in the space of a few terrible minutes, and sailed on afterward with only the one ship that had, by some fortune, anchored outside the Narrows rather than within them. It was on the island of Ogygia that the story slows down and grows strange in a different way. A minor goddess named Circe lived there, in a stone house at the center of a forest full of wolves and mountain lions who had once been men, tamed now into something gentler and sadder than either wolves or men should be, brushing up against strangers on the path the way a favorite dog might, hungry for a kindness they could no longer ask for in words. From inside that house came the sound of a loom and a low, beautiful voice singing over it, and the men who followed that voice indoors were given a cup of wine sweetened with cheese and barley and honey, and one crooked stroke of a wand, and their faces lengthened, and their backs bent forward, and they found themselves grunting and bristled on a floor of clean straw, penned in with acorns and cornel berries for food, weeping human tears from holy animal faces. Circe would have done the same to Odysseus himself if the god Hermes, quick and light on his feet, even among gods, had not met him on the forest road and pressed into his hand a small herb with a black root and a milk-white flower, called moly, which let the drug pass through him without ever taking hold. When her wand struck him, and nothing happened, when he drew his sword instead of dropping to all fours, Circe understood at once whose favor was protecting him, and rather than fight a battle she now knew she would lose, she softened, restored his men to their own shapes and their own faces, and became his companion for a year instead of his captor. And later, poets added their own details to what happened during that year, some claiming she bore him a son who would one day cross paths with his father's story in strange ways. Others, content to leave the year, mostly to silence, a warm door closed on the audience. When the year ended, it was Circe who told him something no one wants to hear, that before he could go home, he would first have to sail to the edge of the world and speak with the dead. The entrance to that gray country was not fire and not stone, but simply a shore where no sun ever properly rose, where the light stayed the color of the hour just before dawn. No matter what hour it actually was, poplar and willow trees losing their leaves along a riverbank that led nowhere a living foot could follow. Odysseus dug a pit, there no wider than a man's forearm, and poured offerings of milk, honey, sweet wine, and water into it, and over the top of all of it, last, the dark blood of 2 sheep he had carried from Circe's own flock for exactly this purpose. The thin, papery voices of the dead came pressing close around the smell of that blood, like moths toward a lamp. Brides and unmarried boys and old men, worn thin by their own long lives, and Odysseus had to hold them all back at sword point, letting only one shade at a time kneel down and drink, because it was the drinking, somehow, that let the dead remember briefly how to speak. Among them came the blind prophet Tiresias, who told him plainly that he would reach home, though late and alone, and find his house full of men who believed him already dead. Among them came his own mother, who he had not known was dead until that very moment, and who told him, in a voice already fading, that grief for her missing son was what had finally worn her down. And among them, unforgettably, came the shade of Achilles, the greatest warrior who had fought at Troy, the man who chose, before the war even began, a short and blazing life over a long and quiet one, because he had been told it would win him a glory that outlasted death itself. Odysseus, meaning to comfort him, told Achilles that he was honored even here, a king among the dead. Achilles' answer has outlived nearly everything else said in that gray country, that he would rather be a poor man's hired servant back among the living, breaking his back in someone else's field under an ordinary sun, than rule as a king over all these fading, whispering shades. Glory, it turned out, made a very cold blanket once the fire that earned it had gone out. Odysseus carried that answer with him, back up into the daylight, the way a person carries a stone in their pocket, without quite knowing why they kept it, not understanding yet how much weight it would end up bearing later, on a much smaller and much quieter island. The road home from the land of the dead ran past a low, flowering meadow that looked peaceful from a distance, and was, up close, littered with the sun-bleached bones of every sailor who had ever tried to reach it. The meadow of the Sirens, whose voices promised each listener the exact thing his own heart most wanted to hear, sung so sweetly and so precisely that men steered their ships straight onto the rocks just to get closer to the sound. Odysseus warmed a wheel of beeswax in his own hands until it went soft, kneaded it into small plugs, and pressed them into his crew's ears so they could hear nothing at all, and had himself bound tight to the mast, arms and legs both, so that he alone could hear the song and still live to describe it, straining against the ropes the whole time, they say, begging his own men to let him go toward those voices, and grateful afterward, in the calm on the far side of the rocks, that they hadn't listened to a word he'd said while the song was playing. Not long after came the narrow strait, where two horrors lived across from each other, close enough to see one from the other's mouth. On one side, a whirlpool named Charybdis swallowed the whole sea 3 times a day and spat it out again, ship and all. If you sailed too close, the water around her drawing down into bare black sand at the bottom before roaring back up white and furious. On the other side lived Scylla, a 6-headed thing fused waist-deep into the cliff wall, 12 legs dangling uselessly beneath her, each of her long necks able to snatch a man straight off a passing deck, faster than he could even cry out, dogs' voices yelping thin and constant from somewhere inside her. There was no way through that avoided both. Odysseus chose to lose 6 men to Scylla, rather than lose the whole ship to Charybdis, and he steered close enough to watch it happen, close enough to hear his own name called out by name from 6 separate throats as the ship pulled past and did not stop. Because it could not stop, because stopping would have meant losing everyone. He would say afterward that this was the worst sight of the whole voyage, worse than anything at Troy, because at Troy, at least, he had been permitted to fight back. The last of the great trials waited on a sunlit island called Thrinacia, where the sacred cattle of the sun god Helios grazed in fields that never grew a single blade of grass out of place. 7 herds of them, broad-browed and gleaming, tended by 2 nymphs who counted them each morning and never once found the number changed. Circe and the prophet Tiresias had both warned him, in almost the same words, that if his men touched those cattle, none of them would ever see Ithaca again. Odysseus tried to sail past the island entirely, but his exhausted crew begged to land just for one night's rest, and a storm pinned them there for a month afterward, food running out day by day, until hunger finally did what warnings could not, and the men slaughtered several of the sacred cows while Odysseus slept apart on a hillside, praying to be spared the temptation. Helios, who sees and hears everything that happens beneath him, complained to the gods with such fury that Zeus himself agreed to punish the crime. The very next clear day, out on open water, a bolt of lightning split the ship in half, and every man aboard drowned within the hour, except one. Odysseus lashed the broken mast to the keel with a length of rigging rope and rode that small unsteady raft for 9 days and 9 nights. Past Scylla and Charybdis a second time with nothing left to steer or fight with, sunburned, salt-crusted, half out of his mind with thirst, until on the 10th morning the current finally set him gently onto a beach he did not recognize, on an island he had never heard named. That island was Ogygia, and the goddess who found him there, half drowned and alone on her own quiet shore, was Calypso. She carried him, this exhausted, salt-cracked, entirely unremarkable mortal man, up from the tide line to her own hearth, and for the first days he could do little more than sleep and drink water and sleep again, unaware that a goddess was tending the fire beside him. When he finally woke enough to understand where he had washed ashore and who was kneeling over him, he must have believed, for a moment, that the worst of it was finally, truly over. That after a war and a decade of drowning ships and lost men, he had somehow drifted into the one safe harbor left in the whole wide, hostile sea. For a while he was right. It would take 7 years and a great deal of quiet, comfortable grief before he understood that a harbor you are never allowed to leave stops being a harbor at all and starts, very slowly, to become something closer to a beautiful, well-appointed cage. So here we are again, back where we began, a man sitting on black volcanic stone with his knees drawn up to his chest, 7 years further into a story that has already cost him everything but his own life. 7 years is a strange, elastic length of time on an island where nothing ages. To Calypso, who has counted centuries the way you or I might count afternoons, it has passed like a single held breath. To Odysseus, every one of those days has landed with its full and separate weight. A year, then another year, then 5 more after that, each one identical to the last in its comfort and its quiet, which is precisely the trouble. One reading of this part of the story suggests that Calypso's offer was never cruel, not even a little, that she genuinely loved him in whatever way a being outside of time is able to love a being inside of it, and that immortality was the truest, most generous gift she had within her power to give. Her cave is warm, its floor swept smooth, its shelves lined with jars of oil and stores of grain that never once run low, no matter how much is taken from them. Her table is never empty, set each evening with bread and roasted meat and a pale golden drink. The old stories call nectar, sweeter than any honey a mortal hive could ever produce, an undiluted wine that never once leaves him with a morning headache to show for it. She sings to him in the evenings, low and unhurried, and some nights, when the fire burns down to embers and the goat bells have gone quiet in the dark outside, he can almost believe he has found the very peace that 10 years of war and 10 years of wandering promised him and never once delivered. Almost. But almost is doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence, and Odysseus, more than anyone, understands the particular ache of an almost that never quite closes the distance. Because here is the strange shape of the gift Calypso is offering. It asks him to keep everything about this island exactly as it is, forever, and to let everything beyond it. Ithaca, his son Telemachus, who was still an infant when his father sailed for Troy and is very nearly a man now, his wife Penelope, who is at this very hour fending off a hall full of suitors with nothing but patience and a half-finished piece of weaving. She unravels every night to buy herself one more day, to let all of it simply fade, the way a name fades if you stop saying it out loud. Immortality, on Ogygia's particular terms, does not mean more of his life. It means the rest of his actual life stops happening, replaced instead with an unbroken, unchanging, undying now. You can watch this arithmetic work itself out on his face most evenings, if you know what to look for. He sits at Calypso's table and eats her nectar-sweetened bread and drinks her wine mixed with water from the spring that never runs dry, and he is, by any reasonable measure, comfortable. And then some small thing, a particular slant of firelight, the smell of wood smoke carried on the wrong angle of wind, the sound of oars he only imagines he hears, reaches into him and finds the ache underneath the comfort, still exactly the size it always was, unhealed by 7 years of ease. Because comfort, it turns out, is not actually the same medicine as purpose, however much the two of them can look alike from a distance. There is a bird that visits the shoreline most mornings, a small kingfisher with a blue back so dark it reads as black except in direct sun when it flashes briefly and vividly alive. Sailors in this part of the world call such birds halcyons and tell a story about a woman named Alcyone who grieved her drowned husband so completely that the gods, moved by a grief that size, turned them both into these same birds and gave the sea a stretch of calm winter days each year, the halcyon days, so the two of them could nest safely on water that would otherwise never sit still long enough to hold a nest. Odysseus has taken to watching this bird the way a person watches a clock they aren't allowed to read. It arrives at dawn, skims the water once, and disappears back into the tree line. And every single morning, for reasons he could not explain to you if you asked him, he waits for it before he lets himself fully wake up. Most days, he walks down to this same stretch of black stone and sits facing the water, and if you sat close enough beside him, close enough to see, not close enough to be seen, you would notice that his eyes are not really watching the waves. They are searching the flat, stitched seam where sky meets sea, the one place on Ogygia that still looks, faintly, like a door. He does this for hours some mornings. Calypso, watching from the cave mouth with the shuttle stilled in her hand, has stopped asking him what he's looking for. She already knows. She simply hopes, every single day, that he will eventually stop looking. While Odysseus watches that empty seam of horizon morning after morning, an ocean and more away, on the island of Ithaca, another vigil is being kept in almost the same patient, aching key. In the great hall of his own house, his wife Penelope sits at a loom nearly as tall as the doorway. Working a wide funeral shroud, she claims she is weaving for her husband's elderly father, to be finished before she will even consider choosing a new husband from among the crowd of suitors who have made her house their own personal banquet hall. What none of those suitors know, what she has kept secret for 3 years running, is that every night, once the hall has gone dark and quiet, she unpicks by torchlight everything her hands wove in daylight, thread by careful thread, so the shroud can never actually be finished, and the question it postpones can never actually be answered. Scholars remain divided on how long a trick like that could plausibly have held up against a houseful of impatient, entitled young men. But in the shape the story has come down to us, it worked for 3 full years before a disloyal servant finally gave the secret away. You could, if you wanted, picture her there for a moment. The small orange glow of a single lamp, the dry whisper of unpicked wool sliding back off the loom's frame, her own shadow thrown huge and trembling against a wall, hung with weapons that belong to a husband no one else in that hall quite believes is still alive. Her son, Telemachus, is nearly grown now, old enough to be humiliated by the suitors feasting on his father's cattle in his father's hall, too young still to drive them out alone. Somewhere below them both, an old dog named Argos, who was still a puppy the last time Odysseus touched him, sleeps on a dung heap by the gate, waiting. The way only a very old, very faithful animal knows how to wait, for a master he has never once stopped listening for. This is the specific, unglamorous, thoroughly mortal shape of the life that immortality on Ogygia would quietly erase, not through any cruelty on Calypso's part, but simply because from outside of time, one small struggling household on one small struggling island might reasonably look like an easy thing to trade away for forever. It is only from inside a single, limited, ticking life that a torchlit loom and a waiting dog and a boy on the edge of manhood can weigh as much as they actually weigh. He does not stop looking. And on one particular morning, an ordinary morning by every visible measure, the goat bells chiming their usual 2 notes, the spring running its usual cool thread down through the rocks. The sea beyond Ogygia goes strangely, perfectly still. Not calm the way a pleasant day is calm, but still in the deeper, older sense, the way a held breath is still right before something is about to be said. Even the goats stop at their idle grazing and lift their heads all at once, ears turned toward the same empty patch of sky. Into that stillness, walking on air the way only a god can walk, comes Hermes, messenger of the gods, guide of souls both living and dead, wearing sandals of woven gold that never once touched the actual ground beneath him. He carries a slim wand tipped with a small unfurling pair of wings, and as he crosses the last stretch of sea toward the island, the scent that arrives ahead of him is nothing like wood smoke or salt. Something closer to warm honey and crushed anise, the smell, Calypso will say later, of a message she already suspects she doesn't want to hear. She receives him with every courtesy a goddess owes another god. A chair drawn near the fire, a cup of nectar poured with her own hand, a table set with food no mortal tongue has ever tasted. And for a while the 2 of them simply sit together in the easy, unhurried way that immortal beings can afford to sit, trading small news of Olympus the way neighbors trade news of a harvest, while Odysseus, unaware that the whole shape of his life is being decided a few dozen steps away, still watches his empty horizon on the shore below. Only once these small rituals are finished does Hermes finally set down his cup and say why cloud-gathering Zeus sent him across so much open water to this one forgotten shore. The other gods on Olympus, he explains, have not forgotten the man on her beach. It was Athena, gray-eyed and quietly relentless, who first raised his case again before the assembled gods, arguing that 7 years of quiet suffering on a beautiful island was punishment enough for one blinded shepherd, however dear that shepherd was to his own father. Zeus agreed, and the message he now sends through Hermes is plain and, for a god, almost gentle. Odysseus is to build himself a raft with his own hands, provisioned and unaided by any further divine trick or delay, and sail east under his own effort until he reaches the land of a seafaring people who will finally carry him the rest of the way to Ithaca. It is time, in other words, for the man to go home, not because the sea's grievance against him has been forgiven exactly, but because it has, at long last, run its full and appointed course, and even divine anger, it seems, has a shape it is required to fill and then release. Calypso's grief at this news is not the loud, performing kind. It moves through her the way weather moves through a valley, a darkening, a stillness, a long, low breath held, and finally let go. She points out, not unreasonably, that the gods have never once minded when one of their own kind kept a mortal lover for a season or 2. That the trouble seems to begin only when a goddess dares to actually love one, rather than simply borrow him for a while. Hermes, to his credit, does not argue the point. He simply repeats the message he was sent to deliver gently, the way you might repeat something to someone you know is already grieving and does not need the news said twice, only heard once, clearly. So it falls to Calypso to walk down to the black stone shoreline herself, for what both of them somehow already understand will be the last time she comes to sit beside him uninvited. She finds Odysseus in his usual place, the sea in front of him gone briefly, uncannily calm, and she tells him, without any of the ceremony a lesser goddess might have reached for, that he is free to build a raft and go. For a moment, and this detail has survived retelling after retelling precisely because it is so achingly human, he does not quite believe her. 7 years of hoping for a door and none appearing will do that to a person. It teaches the mind to distrust its own good news. He asks her, carefully, whether this is some fresh trial in disguise, some new shape of the punishment he has already worn out 7 different names for. Calypso swears the old, binding oath that gods swear on the river of the underworld itself, the one oath that cannot be broken even by accident, that no trap is hidden anywhere in what she is offering him now. Safe passage, freely given, this time with nothing owed in return. And it is only after she says this, only once the leaving is finally, actually possible, that she asks him the question the whole quiet argument of the last 7 years had really been circling the whole time. Why, she wants to know, would any mortal choose the difficulty of going home over the certainty of staying here? She is not asking to be cruel or to change his mind through guilt. She genuinely wants to understand. She tells him plainly that she does not believe herself less lovely than the wife he is sailing back toward. How could a woman who ages, who will one day be gray and stooped and gone, possibly outshine a goddess who will never once lose a single thing time usually takes? And besides all of that, she reminds him, the road ahead is not even safe. More suffering waits for him out there, more storms, more grief, before he ever sees his own shore again. Here, none of that can touch him. Here there is nothing left to survive, because nothing here can hurt him in the first place. Odysseus does not answer right away. Out over the flat, unnaturally quiet water, the small kingfisher he has watched every morning for 7 years crosses the shoreline once, low and quick, a single dark blue flicker against all that stillness, and disappears again into the tree line the way it always does. He watches it go the whole way out of sight before he finally turns back to her. Odysseus's answer, when it comes, is careful and unhurried. The answer of a man who has clearly turned this exact question over in his own hands more nights than he could easily count. He tells her, first gently, that she is right, that no living woman could stand beside a goddess and win that particular comparison. Not in beauty, not in grace, not in any of the ways a person might be measured against someone outside of time altogether. He is not arguing that Penelope is more beautiful than Calypso. That was never the actual question. What he wants, instead, is simply his own life, the specific, unrepeatable, limited one he already started. He wants to watch his son finish growing into whatever kind of man he is going to become, rather than hear about it secondhand, if he hears about it at all. He wants to grow old, visibly, beside a woman who is also growing old, so that the two of them arrive at the same weathered place together, instead of one of them standing forever outside the door. The other one is slowly, naturally walking through. He tells her, and this is the heart the whole story has been quietly walking toward from the very first night on that black stone shore, that a life which never has to end is not actually a bigger life. It is simply a life with the ending removed, and the ending, painful as it is to admit, might be the very thing that gives all the rest of it its weight and its shape and its urgency. Achilles chose blazing glory over a long, ordinary life, and found, once he had it, that glory made a cold companion in the dark. Odysseus, watching that lesson land on someone else so he wouldn't have to learn it the same hard way, has chosen the opposite path entirely. Not glory, and now offered the chance, not eternity either. Only the plain, mortal, finite thing. A home, a wife, a son, an ending that will one day genuinely arrive, and because of that, a life that actually, urgently, matters while it lasts. He admits, too, more quietly, that it isn't only the large things he misses. It's the smaller ones underneath them. The particular smell of his own olive terraces after rain, a bed he built himself around the living trunk of a tree so that it could never be moved from its place, the sound of his old dog barking at the gate before he even opens it. None of that exists on Ogygia, however beautiful Ogygia is, because none of it belongs to Ogygia. It belongs to one specific, unrepeatable stretch of rocky coastline, waiting for him, aging without him, and it will only ever mean what it means if he is aging right alongside it. Calypso listens to all of this without interrupting, her expression softening somewhere in the middle of it, from disbelief into something closer to a very old, very familiar sorrow. The particular grief of a being who cannot die, standing across from a man who has just explained, gently and completely, why he would rather be able to. To ancient listeners gathered around a fire much like this one, this choice would have carried a weight that can be easy for us to miss from this far away. A hero's worth in that world was measured in two separate currencies: the glory that outlived a person's death and the successful, completed homecoming that made the whole difficult journey worth something while a person was still alive to feel it worth something. Odysseus offered a shortcut around both of death's oldest terrors, the fear of being forgotten, answered here by simple endlessness, and the fear of dying far from everyone who loves you, answered here by a home that would never age past him, turns down the shortcut entirely and chooses instead to walk the long, exhausting, uncertain road home on his own 2 feet, arriving worn out, sunburnt, and thoroughly, completely mortal. Calypso, for her part, does not argue with him further. Whatever grief she carries afterward, she carries it the way old gods generally do, quietly, without spectacle, folded away behind centuries of practice at losing things she was never permitted to keep. She leads him instead to a stand of tall trees near the shoreline, alder, black poplar, towering fir, and shows him, without a trace of bitterness in her voice, exactly which ones are driest and best suited to holding together against open water. She lends him her own bronze axe, wide-bladed and perfectly balanced, and an adze for smoothing the planks once they're cut, and she stands nearby through 4 full days of steady work, watching him fell trees, trim them, drill them through with a hand-turned bit, and lash them tight into a raft with rope of his own braiding. The clean smell of split fir fills the whole hillside by the 2nd day, resin gathering sticky and gold along every fresh-cut edge, and by the 4th evening, a proper deck stands finished on the sand, wide enough for a man to lie down flat across it, a single mast rising from its center, ready for a sail that does not exist yet. On the 5th day, she brings him cloth for a sail and helps him rig it herself, her hands moving with an ease that makes the whole difficult work look almost effortless. She loads the finished raft with more provisions than the crossing could possibly require: skins of dark wine, fresh water, a store of grain, dried meat wrapped carefully against the salt air, and she sends, along with all of it, a following wind, warm and steady, exactly the kind of wind a sailor prays for and almost never actually receives. It is, in its own restrained and dignified way, one of the more generous farewells in this entire long story. A goddess who loved a mortal man for 7 years, understood completely why he was leaving her anyway, and helped him leave as well and as safely as her own power allowed. At the very end, before he wades out to climb aboard, she stands with him a moment longer on the black stone shoreline where all of this began, and there is no final speech, no last attempt to change his mind, only her hand resting once, briefly, against the side of his sun-worn face, the way you might touch something you already know you are about to lose, memorizing it on purpose before it goes. Odysseus pushes off from that quiet shore on a morning windless everywhere, except directly behind his single small sail, and for the first time in 7 years, he watches an island shrink slowly astern of him, rather than grow larger up ahead. Ogygia sinking gently back down into the sea haze, the way a dream sinks back down once the sleeper begins, gently, to wake. He does not yet know that Poseidon will spot him from a distant mountaintop and raise one final storm against him almost as soon as Ogygia disappears from view, that the raft will be broken apart by that storm, that he will swim for 2 more days before another shore finally, mercifully appears beneath him. He does not yet know how many more small trials wait between this moment and the actual doorway of his own home. What he knows, sitting on that raft under a sky finally properly open above him, is simply that he is moving in the right direction at last, toward an ending that will actually arrive, toward people who are aging exactly as he himself is aging, toward a home that means something precisely because it is not permanent, precisely because none of it, not the home, not the wife, not the son, not even his own life, was ever going to last forever in the first place. And maybe that, more than any monster or any storm, is the real center of this particular story. Not the wooden horse, not the Cyclops or the Sirens or the six-headed thing in the narrow strait. Just one tired man on one small, quiet island, given the chance to stop time altogether, who looked at that offer honestly, all the way through, and understood that a life without an ending is not a gift so much as it is an absence of the very stakes that make an ordinary evening, an ordinary meal, an ordinary hand held across an ordinary table, feel like something worth sailing years of open, dangerous water to get back to. The night is settling in fully now, out past the edge of this story, and the raft Odysseus built with his own two hands moves on quietly under stars that have not changed their positions in 3,000 years. The same slow wheel of light turning overhead tonight that turned above him then. Somewhere behind him, Calypso's fire burns low in a cave that no longer needs to hold anyone. Somewhere ahead of him, a small kingfisher, or one very like it, will go on skimming some other shoreline at dawn, arriving and departing, in the small steady rhythm that only a finite, breathing, aging thing can actually keep. And somewhere in between the two, on open water under an open sky, a man who was offered forever and chose instead to go home drifts on toward morning. Let your own breathing settle into something like that same steady rhythm now. In and out and in again, unhurried, the way the tide moves against black stone that has never once needed to hurry toward anything. You don't have to follow the raft any further tonight. You don't have to know exactly how the rest of the crossing goes, or how many more mornings pass before the coastline of home finally comes into view, or how a torchlit loom on a distant island is finally, quietly finished. That part of the story will still be there whenever you're ready for it. For now, let the stars keep their slow wheel turning without you. Let the fire in that far-off cave burn down to embers on its own. Let the sea, wherever you are, go still and quiet and entirely undemanding, the way it goes still sometimes in the deep middle of the night, halcyon calm, holding nothing back and asking nothing in return. Somewhere, a small blue-backed bird is asleep in a tree line you will never see, waiting without knowing it waits for one more ordinary dawn. Somewhere, a man drifts under an open sky, no longer counting the years he has left, only trusting that there will be exactly as many as there are meant to be, and that this, in the end, was always the better gift. You are allowed to rest now, the same unremarkable, priceless way he was finally allowed to go home. You are allowed to let go of the thread of the story completely, the way a hand loosens naturally around something it no longer needs to hold. Sleep, when it comes, is its own kind of safe harbor, and you have already, quietly, arrived.